Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. There's a rhythm to the old church calendar, slow turning of names, feast days, and centuries. You've probably never looked at one closely, but if you had, you'd see that every single day of the year used to belong to someone. Some were apostles, others were monks, some were martyrs burned alive in distant provinces, others were nuns who supposedly glowed when they prayed. Each day carried a story. Each story was remembered in quiet chapels. A flickering candle, a whispered mass, a name carved gently into time. But then, one day, they began disappearing. Not all at once, not loudly, but quietly, deliberately, with pens scratching across the pages of liturgical reform. This is the story of one of those disappearances. Not the grandest, not the most controversial, but perhaps the most puzzling. The story of Saint Philomena, a saint who was once so beloved she had more churches named after her than Saint Francis, a saint who inspired thousands of prayers, pilgrimages, and supposed miracles. And then, suddenly, she was gone from the church calendar, erased, almost as if she had never existed at all. To begin with, Saint Philomena's story is strange because it begins not in the early centuries of Christianity, but in the 1800s. In 1802, deep beneath the streets of Rome, workers were clearing an ancient burial site, the Priscilla catacombs, long abandoned and filled with rubble. There, in the quiet dust, they found a tomb sealed with clay tiles, written. On the tiles were the words, "Peace be with you, Philomena." Alongside the words were symbols, a palm branch symbol of martyrdom, an anchor symbol of hope, an arrow, and a lily symbol of purity. Inside the tomb were bones, just fragments, remains of a young girl, perhaps 13 or 14 years old. That was all. No records, no stories, no writings about her from the early church, just a name and a few symbols that hinted at suffering. But the discovery came at a time when Europe was desperate for saints. The Napoleonic Wars had left people shaken. Religious orders had been shut down. The faithful were longing for something sacred and unshakable. So when word of the discovery spread, devotion to Saint Philomena grew quickly. Her relics were moved to a small town in southern Italy called Magnano del Cardinale. And soon, reports of miracles began to surface. A paralyzed woman said she could walk again after touching Philomena's remains. Child was cured of seizures. One woman said the saint appeared to her in a dream and told her to return to church. By the 1830s, devotion had spread across Europe. One priest, John Vianney, known as the Cure of Arza, beloved priest in Catholic histories, wore by her intercession. He kept her statue on his altar and believed she helped him survive his hardest years. By the 1850s, chapels, altars, and parishes were being named after Philomena. Holy cards with her image were sold in France, Ireland, Brazil, and even the United States. But as her popularity grew, some church scholars started feeling uneasy because no one could find any historical record of her, no mention in early lists of saints, no trace in ancient writings, no biography, just a name on a tomb. Still, the faithful didn't mind. In 1837, Pope Gregory XVI officially recognized her as a saint, not because of what she did in life, but because of the devotion that followed her discovery. It was rare, it was debated, but it was accepted. For over 100 years, her feast, day August 11th, was included in the church calendar. Her name was known, her relics venerated, her miracles printed in local papers. She was, in every way, a saint. until 1969. That year, after the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, the Church made major changes to its calendar. The goal was to simplify things, to focus on saints with confirmed histories and universal relevance. Some feast days were moved. Some saints became local only, and some, like Filomeno, were quietly removed. There was no announcement, no explanation, just absence. Not condemned, not declared false, just gone. The Church explained, only saints with confirmed stories would remain on the universal calendar. Filomena didn't have one, and so she disappeared. But what does it mean to remove a saint? In Catholic tradition, it doesn't mean she's no longer holy. It just means she's no longer celebrated globally. Her feast day isn't official anymore. Her name was taken out of the list of saints. Her Mass can't be said unless a bishop allows it. And for most people, that means forgetting. Churches still bear her name, but new ones don't. Most Catholics today have never heard of her. Still, her relics remain. Her tomb in Magnano still receives visitors. Some still light candles and whisper prayers. So why remove her? Not because she was unloved. Not because the Church feared her, but because she didn't fit the modern standard. Okay? She was a saint for a time of longing. A saint of relics, not records. And when the world changed, when the Church leaned toward reason and historical clarity, she was left behind. But maybe her story isn't over. Maybe Saint Filomena wasn't erased by doubt, but by a shift in what we value. Because history isn't just about facts. Sometimes it's about what survives the edits. What stories are lost when we favor evidence over emotion? And what might still live in the quiet hearts of the forgotten faithful? The decision to remove Saint Filomena from the liturgical calendar was not made with fanfare or scandal. It was made in a quiet meeting room, somewhere in the depths of the Vatican, during a process so slow and deliberate that few outside the Church hierarchy even noticed. But for those who did, it was deeply unsettling to understand the Church's decision. One must look more closely at what changed in the mid-20th century. Vatican II wasn't just a shift in liturgical style or language, it was a reordering of priorities. The Church, as it had done many times before, was attempting to reconcile ancient traditions with modern scrutiny. It was no longer enough for a saint to be beloved. Now, they had to be historically verifiable. This wasn't a new idea, really. The Catholic Church has long wrestled with the tension between folklore and fact. But for centuries, it had largely tolerated, even embraced, that gray area, those spaces where faith filled in what history lacked. The lives of the saints had always included miracles, visions, sometimes even dragons and talking animals. They were as much moral stories as they were biographies by the 1960s. However, scholars within the Church had become more careful, more cautious. They began to comb through the hagiographies with a historian's eye, asking difficult questions. Did this person really exist? Do we have any evidence? If not, should we still call them a saint? For Saint Filomena, the answers were not reassuring. There were no texts from the early Church that mentioned her. No bishops had ever written about her before the 1800s. The only evidence of her life was a set of broken tiles and some symbols interpreted centuries later, and the stories that had grown around her about her supposed martyrdom. Her vow of virginity, her defiance of the Roman Emperor Diocletian, had all come from private revelations, dreams, or visions reported by 19th century mystics. None of them were historical documents, so the Church made its decision. Her name was removed from the universal calendar, not invalidated, not condemned, just set aside. And with that, something quiet began to happen, not just to her legacy, but to the very way people remembered Saint Filomena had once represented. Something deeply human, the need to believe in someone who heard you, someone unknown to the scholars, but known to the heart. Her veneration hadn't come from books or bishops, it had come from the people, the sick, the poor, the desperate. They were the ones who had carried her name across oceans and into Chapels, and now they were being asked to stop. But many didn't. In Magnano del Cardinale, where her relics had been kept since 1805, devotion never really ended. Pilgrims continued to visit. Nuns continued to care for her shrine. Stories of miracles, though less publicized, still quietly circulated. Local bishops, particularly in parts of Italy and Brazil, continued to allow her feast day to be celebrated. Her name remained in parish bulletins and in whispered prayers. In homes, her portrait still hung on kitchen walls, beside crucifixes and images of the Sacred Heart. Because for many ordinary Catholics, the question wasn't whether she had existed. The question was whether she had helped them. And in that, they were certain. One of the more curious aspects of Philomena's story is how thoroughly it bypassed academic theology. Unlike saints such as Augustine or Aquinas, she had no writings to study, no sermons to analyze, no theological debates attached to her name. She was, in a sense, pure devotion, and because of that, she also became something else, a case study. Historians began to use her as a lens through which to understand the nature of sainthood itself. What made someone worthy of veneration? Was it miracles? Was it moral example? Was it public devotion? Or was it documentation? In the wake of Vatican II, the Church leaned heavily toward the last. But this shift raised uncomfortable questions, because if historical documentation was now the standard, what of the thousands of early Christian martyrs whose names and stories had been lost? What of the saints who were remembered only in oral tradition in villages far from Rome, in dialects no longer spoken? Were they now less holy, less real? And if so, what did that say about the nature of memory itself? Was it something to be curated only by scholars? Or was there still room for the folk saints, the whispered names, the candles lit in the shadows? These weren't just academic questions. They touched something raw in the people who had spent their lives praying to these saints. Imagine growing up with a devotion to Saint Philomena. Imagine praying to her every night, lighting a candle before a statue when a child was sick, thanking her silently when a husband came home safe from war. Then imagine opening the new church calendar one morning and seeing that she was no longer there. No explanation, no ceremony, just absence. For many, it felt like a betrayal. Not because they believed the church had done something malicious, but because it seemed to forget the very people it was meant to serve. The poor, the rural, the unseen, the ones who couldn't read Latin, but who knew how to say a rosary. The ones who never read a theological tract, but who believed fiercely in the power of saints to intervene. To this day, the question of Philomena remains unresolved. Some theologians argue that her cult should never have existed in the first place, that it was built on misunderstandings, superstition, and emotional need. Others point to the fruits of her devotion, the conversions, the acts of charity, the faith renewed in her name. They argue that sainthood is not just about history, it's about hope. And hope, as any historian knows, does not always wait for documentation. The Church, for its part, has offered a quiet compromise while she remains off the official universal calendar. She has never been formally unsainted. Her feast day can still be celebrated in places where devotion continues. Her relics have not been removed. Her shrines have not been closed. She exists now in a kind of ecclesiastical limbo, not forbidden, not affirmed, just paused. And for some, it's enough, because perhaps what Philomena represents is larger than her own name. She represents the fragility of historical memory. It's the way stories survive, not because they are written down, but because they are held in hearts. She represents the power of ordinary people to shape what matters in religion, not through councils or encyclicals, but through candles and prayers and quiet belief. And she represents, perhaps most poignantly, the discomfort the modern world has with mystery. In a time that demands proof, Philomena offers none. And maybe that's why she was removed. But maybe that's also why she remains. And so the question lingers. If a saint can be forgotten, not because she failed, but because she did not leave behind enough paperwork, what does that say about the rest of us? Well, parts of history vanish simply because no one bothers to write them down. Okay? What other names, like hers, wait quietly in the shadows, carved into broken tiles, whispered in dialects now lost, remembered not by scholars, but by the faithful. The faithful. There's something haunting about silence, especially the kind that follows an erasure. Saint Philomena was never condemned. She was never officially discredited. Her name was not disgraced or scandalized. It was simply absent. And that kind of quiet absence creates a void more unsettling than any loud denial. It's not that she was disproven, it's that she was unspoken. But in the long arc of church history, kind of forgetting isn't new. The calendar of saints so central to Catholic daily life has always been a strange mixture of history, politics, popular devotion, and institutional caution. While some saints were canonized through formal processes, others simply became saints because people treated them as such. They were prayed to, talked about, honored in the rhythms of peasant life. And over time, that reverence calcified into something official, but the modern church, especially in the wake of Vatican II, became far more skeptical of these informal traditions. What had once been a sprawling forest of saints was now trimmed into a neater, more manageable garden. Philomena wasn't alone in her quiet removal. Between 1969 and the early 1970s, nearly 30 saints were taken off the general Roman calendar. Some of their names you may never have heard: Saint Ursula and her 11,000 virgins, Saint Christopher, Saint Barbara, Saint Catherine of Alexandria. And yet, for centuries, these saints had shaped the rhythm of people's lives. They were the patrons of travelers, of miners, of scholars. They guarded bridges, watched over childbirth, stood at the edge of prayers before journeys. To remove them was not just a matter of editing a calendar, it was erasing part of how people understood the sacred. The Vatican's rationale made sense. From a scholarly perspective, many of these saints had little or no historical evidence. Some were likely mythological, others were duplicates of earlier saints whose identities had blurred over time. For millions of Catholics especially, those outside Europe, these names were not abstractions. They were real, personal, woven into the fabric of everyday survival. This, then, is the deeper story behind Philomena's disappearance. It's not about a single name, it's about a shift in the very nature of belief. In many ways, the removal of saints like Philomena marked the beginning of a new kind of church that increasingly aligned itself with historical criticism, with documentation, with systems of verification. Saints were no longer saints just because the people believed in them. They needed evidence. They needed paperwork. In the process, the church moved slightly further from its folk roots. You see, the Catholic Church was never a monolith. It was always layered Rome at the top, yes, but with vast networks of local belief underneath. In rural villages, in fishing communities, in dusty farming towns, saints were not simply names on a liturgical calendar. They were family, friends, protectors, mediators between this world and the next. Philomena, despite having no ancient text in her favor, had tapped into that deep current of need. She was young, pure, courageous, perfect figure for a world longing for divine intimacy. And in the 19th century, when the church was losing influence in many parts of Europe, saints like Philomena provided a simple, powerful answer. God still listens, even to the forgotten. So what happens when the church no longer listens to those who listened to her? What happens when it turns its back not out of malice, but out of institutional caution? The shrine in Magnano del Cardinale still exists. Walk through its quiet halls today, and you'll see faded frescoes, votive candles, crutches left behind in gratitude. There are handwritten notes, photographs of children, rosaries wrapped around stone fingers. People still come, not in the thousands, perhaps, but they come. They come because something was given to them. Here's something the historical revision could not take away. And that's the part of the story that scholars sometimes miss. Because while it's true that Philomena may never have lived, it's also true that she changed people's lives. She inspired acts of charity, reawakened broken faith, comforted grief. Her name was whispered in hospital rooms, called out in storms, stitched into wedding veils. Her story, however fabricated, became a kind of spiritual shorthand for resilience. The question, then, is this: if something untrue still helps people survive, is it truly without value? The church, for all its hierarchy, has always been deeply human. Behind every decision, every council, every calendar revision, every quiet removal is a group of people trying to balance faith with responsibility. The men who decided to revise the liturgical calendar were not villains. They were historians, theologians, caretakers of a 2,000-year-old institution struggling to maintain credibility in a skeptical world. They didn't intend to hurt anyone. They were trying to clarify, to purify, to prune back centuries of overlapping legends so that the church might move forward with confidence and consistency. But in doing so, they also revealed something painful, that even in religion, truth is often chosen, curated, controlled, and in the process, what is lost is not just names or feast days. What is lost is mystery. Some Catholic communities have resisted these changes. In places like Poland, Brazil, the Philippines, and rural Italy, devotion to the removed saints continues. Saint Christopher still rides on car dashboards. Saint Barbara still guards the mines. Saint Philomena still hears the prayers of the lonely. And this quiet resistance reveals something as profound, that the sacred does not always follow the official path, that even when a name is erased from the books, it may live on in the breath of a prayer. And perhaps that is the final irony of the Vatican's decision. By trying to erase saints with no history, it reminded the world of what those saints had always symbolized, that faith is not always rational, that love does not need a record, that sometimes the stories we cling to are less about proof, and more about presence. As we end this story of Saint Philomena and, by extension, all the forgotten saints, what remains is not a sense of closure. There is no final answer. There is no certainty about her identity. No archaeological breakthrough, no lost document waiting to be found. There is only silence, and in that silence, an echo of candles lit in defiance, of shrines tended without approval, of names whispered in the dark. Not because they are remembered by Rome, but because they are remembered by the heart. Before maps stretched across every classroom wall, and before GPS satellites could chart your path from doorstep to distant shore, there was only hope and Saint Christopher. For centuries, his face was the first one seen by sailors before voyages, by pilgrims before crossing mountains, by mothers kissing the foreheads of children sent to work far from home. Saint Christopher, the giant who carried the child Christ across a swollen river, was not just a legend. He was a presence, a safeguard, a name murmured into the wind before the road began. And then, one day, the Vatican erased him. It happened, quietly, without scandal. No accusations, no burning of statues, just a decision in a room somewhere. Saint Christopher would be removed from the official church calendar. His feast day once celebrated with processionals and blessings of vehicles, and prayers for safe passage would no longer be universally recognized. Churches weren't forbidden from honoring him, but they were no longer required to. The message was subtle, but clear. He likely never existed, and if he did, his story had long been distorted beyond recognition. It was time, said the scholars, to make room for saints with real historical grounding. But if you travel the world today, something curious remains. Christopher is still there, dangling from keychains in Mexico, perched on the dashboards of tuk-tuks in Bangkok, etched into the side of taxis in Nairobi, tattooed onto forearms, hanging in the rearview mirror of trucks hauling goods across the Balkans, painted onto doors in villages that haven't seen a priest in decades. Saint Christopher, erased from the calendar, remained in motion. And perhaps that's the story that needs to be told. Not just the history of its removal, but the deeper question it raises. What does it mean when the church forgets someone that people remember? To understand how Saint Christopher came to occupy such a towering place in Catholic devotion, we need to go back not just to the early church, but to the murky centuries when myth and faith were often indistinguishable. Christopher's legend, as recorded in various medieval texts, tells of a man of immense size, sometimes said to be 12 feet tall, who roamed the earth seeking the strongest master to serve. First, he served a mighty king, but realizing the king feared the devil, he sought out the devil instead. But then he noticed that even the devil seemed to fear the sign of the cross, and so left his service as well. Eventually, Christopher came upon a hermit who instructed him in the Christian faith and tasked him with using his great strength to serve others. His job was simple: to carry travelers across a dangerous river where many had drowned. A child asked to be carried. As Christopher bore him across the rushing current, the boy's weight became unbearable, almost as if he were carrying the weight of the world. When they reached the other side, the child revealed himself as Christ, and Christopher's name means Christ-bearer was forever changed. It's a beautiful tale, poetic in its simplicity and layered with meaning. A man who seeks strength learns that true power lies in service. A man who bore others physically comes to carry Christ spiritually. A brute becomes a saint, not through miracles, but through labor, humility, and water. There's no definitive record of where this story came from. Scholars believe it was likely shaped from older folk legends. The earliest known depictions of Christopher appear in 5th and 6th century mosaics in the Eastern Roman Empire, particularly in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. But by the Middle Ages, the story had swept through Europe. He became one of the 14 holy helper saints, especially venerated during times of illness and danger, and most crucially, became the patron of travelers, a role that grew in importance during centuries of pilgrimage, trade routes, crusades, and voyages into unknown worlds. Every road had its risks: bandits, illness, falling off a cliff, ships that vanished over the horizon, never to return. Saint Christopher was a kind of insurance, a spiritual border crossing, a reminder that someone was watching. By the 19th century, his image had become almost ubiquitous. His statues stood at the entrances of churches and villages. In Catholic homes, parents taught their children the phrase, "If you see Saint Christopher's face, you'll never die without grace." During World War I and II, soldiers carried Christopher medals with them into trenches and air raids. The rise of cars brought a new wave of devotion. Now he protected against collisions and breakdowns. Clergy began blessing automobiles, using Christopher as the figurehead, safety in motion. But there was always a quiet tension beneath his popularity. The church never had solid evidence of Christopher's life. No authenticated writings, no verified tomb. The hagiographies varied wildly in details and versions, even described him as having the face of a dog, a distortion likely born from early mistranslations or confusion with Egyptian saints. Scholars noted the mythological structure of his story and began to suggest he may have been a Christianized version of older pagan figures, perhaps even inspired by Hercules, the river crosser of Greek lore. When Vatican II convened in the 1960s, reform was in the air. The Church wanted to modernize, to refine, to become more accessible and credible to a world increasingly skeptical of unproven legends. And so, a committee was formed. They reviewed the general Roman calendar, the list of saints commemorated by name in the liturgical cycle, and began making cuts. The goal was not to deny the faith of the people, but to streamline the calendar to focus on saints with clear historical records and global significance. Saint Christopher, along with many others, didn't make the cut. In 1969, his feast day, once celebrated on July 25th, was officially removed from the universal calendar. He was not unsainted. That's a common misunderstanding. His name was still honored in certain local traditions, and individual churches could still celebrate him, but his erasure from the main calendar marked a shift. It meant he was no longer officially required. He became optional, like a page you could skip. But faith does not always follow the official path. The Vatican may have removed Christopher from its calendar, but the people did not remove him from their lives. In fact, in some parts of the world, his devotion to Saint Christopher increased after his removal, perhaps in quiet protest. Perhaps because people needed someone like him more than ever. In the post-war decades, the world was becoming more mobile. Migration, highways, commercial flights, space exploration. Saint Christopher, ironically, was the perfect saint for a world on the move. He wasn't confined to theology or metaphysics. He was practical, grounded. He helped with actual things like arriving safely, surviving the storm, making it home alive in places like Latin America and Southern Europe. People continued to carry his image. Parents still placed medals in their children's backpacks. Bus drivers still glued his picture to their windshields. Pilgrims still whispered his name for stepping into the unknown. The Vatican had removed a name, but it had not removed the need. And so, the story of St. Christopher becomes something more than a hagiography. It becomes a story about tension between history and myth, between authority, between devotion, between the church and the people it serves. Because ultimately, the removal of Christopher from the calendar was not about disbelief. It was about a new framework, one that prioritized record over resonance, clarity over comfort. But in doing so, it left many feeling that something personal had been taken from them. A familiar face, voice in the dark, a giant who once promised, "I will carry you." So here we are in a world of satellites and flight paths and digital maps. The figure of St. Christopher still lingers, not because we believe he really walked the earth, it's a towering man who carried Jesus across a river, but because his story still makes sense, because we are still crossing dangerous waters every day, in our own ways. And maybe what people still want is not a saint with documents and dates, but one who shows up when it matters, when the road begins, when the current is strong, when you're carrying more than you thought you could bear. In the years following his quiet removal from the Vatican's official calendar in 1969, the name St. Christopher didn't vanish scattered. It flowed into corners and cultures like river water, finding its own course. You could no longer expect to find him mentioned at Mass on July 25th, but you might still find him tucked behind the steering wheel of a delivery truck in São Paulo, or engraved in silver around the neck of a hiker winding his way through the Pyrenees. There's something profoundly human about that. When institutions revise, people preserve. When books are rewritten, the bookmarks stay behind. St. Christopher may not have survived the scrutiny of a panel of ecclesiastical historians, but he survived in glove compartments, in pockets, in memory. The question isn't just why the church removed him, it's why the people never did. To answer that, You have to look not at theology, but at travel itself, because for most of history, travel wasn't leisure, it was risk, and few saints were made for risk quite like Christopher. Imagine the average traveler in the year 1,200. There were no signposts, no guarantees of shelter. Rivers were dangerous to cross. Forests were filled with robbers. Illness could set in miles from help. Maps were scarce and inaccurate. If you were lucky, you followed a well-worn pilgrimage route. If you were poor, you relied on memory, stars, or rumors. To step beyond your village was to gamble with your life. And into this anxious space stepped St. Christopher. He wasn't glamorous. He wasn't royal. He didn't preach or hold councils. He carried dot. His story was simple. He bore burdens. He delivered others to safety. He was strong, not in the way that required admiration, but in the way that inspired relief. And that made him profoundly accessible for medieval Christians. He was a spiritual companion in a deeply physical world, not a philosopher, a ferryman. There's a curious irony in his name, Christopher. Christ, dash-bearer, for while he carried Christ across the river in legend, it was often the image of Christopher that Christians believed would bear them. There was a widespread medieval belief that if you saw an image of St. Christopher in the morning, you would not die that day. This wasn't just poetic, it was deeply practical. Churches responded accordingly. Giant paintings and frescoes of Christopher began appearing on the outside walls of churches, facing the roads, so that even those who didn't step inside could see him and be protected. Some of these murals were enormous, towering over marketplaces and city gates. He was painted to be seen from a distance, a massive figure wading through water with the Christ child perched on his shoulder. As if even heaven needed a lift through this world. The images were so important that cities allocated public funds to have them restored. It was civic infrastructure, just as a city might repair a crumbling bridge. It also maintained its image of St. Christopher. The scale of devotion was practical, almost bureaucratic, but it carried a deep comfort. A traveler passing by an image of Christopher was like passing a checkpoint, a quiet promise, a whispered prayer made solid. And over time, his image moved from walls to objects, tiny pewter medals, wooden carvings, ink, illustrations, and pocketbooks. St. Christopher became small enough to carry, and so the man who carried others was now carried himself. This evolution from saint to symbol is part of a broader trend in Catholic history. Many saints began their lives as people real or legendary, but evolved into metaphors. St. Christopher was no exception. By the 19th century, as global travel exploded with steamships and railroads, his presence adapted to fit modern times. He was still the patron of travelers. But now, the dangers looked different. Car crashes, engine failures, railway accidents. In the church, despite beginning to quietly question his historicity, continued to lean into the public's devotion. Special blessings for cars became common. St. Christopher, protect us, was etched into dashboard plaques. In America, whole businesses sprang up around saintly merchandise, medals, rosaries, dashboard figurines. But even as this modern devotion surged, trouble was brewing in the theological halls of Rome. Historians were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. Where were the original sources? Why were there no verified relics? Why did the details of Christopher's life differ so wildly between regions? Was he even a real person? Or was he, like so many figures of early Christianity, a compositor, tapestry woven from older myths, folk stories, and theological metaphors? And in the era of Vatican II, with its focus on modernization and historical scrutiny, these questions mattered. The committee responsible for the revision of the general Roman calendar faced a difficult task. The church's calendar was too full. Over 1,000 saints were celebrated throughout the year, and many of them were based on stories that frankly, lacked solid historical foundation. It wasn't just Christopher on the chopping block. Saints like Valentine, Philomena, and George were also scrutinized. The goal wasn't to erase faith, but to bring clarity, to focus liturgical celebration on those saints whose lives could be traced and verified with historical documents. Saint Christopher, with his oversized legend and lack of records, was an easy target. So in 1969, Sacred Congregation for Divine Worship removed his feast day from the universal calendar. He wasn't decanonized. That would have caused an uproar. He was simply demoted, made optional, left behind. But the removal had a curious effect. It stirred something in many places. Devotion to Christopher didn't decline, intensified. Some saw it as a form of quiet rebellion. Others simply didn't care what Rome said. In parishes across Europe and Latin America, the celebrations continued. Images stayed on church walls. Blessings for travelers didn't cease. His name remained on the lips of taxi drivers, sailors, and pilots. And in some ways, this reaction said more than the decree itself, because it revealed what Christopher had become. Not a historical figure to be proven or disproven, but a symbol of something deeper, of protection, of strength in transit, of comfort in uncertainty. There's something profound in how the devotion to St. Christopher spread in absence of official recognition. It mirrors the way oral traditions persist after written records vanish. It reminds us that belief is not always tied to historical proof. Sometimes belief flows like a current, carrying with it fear, memory, hope, and story. And sometimes the most powerful figures in our spiritual lives are not those with dates and documents, but those who show up in the most vulnerable of moments. When your child gets on a bus for the first time, when your partner boards a plane during a storm, when you step onto a highway after dark, it's unsure if the tires will hold or the map is right. In those moments, you don't reach for the archives. You reach for the familiar face, the one carrying the child across the water, the one who says, "You'll get there today." St. Christopher exists in a strange liminal space. He is technically still a saint, still included in the Roman Martyrology, the official list of recognized saints. But his feast is optional. His story is questioned, and yet his presence remains undeniable. It's on pendants sold in airport gift shops, on the dashboards of rideshare, drivers dotting the prayers of parents waving from porches. He remains, in many ways, the most widely carried saint in the modern world, even if the church has turned its attention elsewhere. And perhaps that is the lesson of this strange erasure, that saints don't disappear when the calendar changes. They disappear when people stop remembering them. And St. Christopher, the ferryman, the traveler's friend, has not been forgotten, not by the road-weary, not by the anxious, not by those who move through a world of shifting ground, unmarked paths, marked paths. So what happens when a saint becomes too beloved to vanish, but too mythical to remain on the official books? What becomes of a figure like St. Christopher's, so omnipresent in the everyday lives of believers, yet so elusive under the gaze of historians? To answer that, we step back once again, not into theology or doctrine, but into daily life, the quiet, unnoticed places where Christopher continued to travel long after his feast day was removed. You might find him in a pocket, hanging on a chain next to a house key. You might find him engraved in brass above the door of a cargo ship, outlasting rust and repaintings. You might even find him, small and smiling, pressed into the plastic dashboard of a tuk-tuk in Manila, or carefully wrapped in cloth and pinned into a child's backpack in rural Ireland. St. Christopher became something more than a story. He became a habit, and habits are far harder to erase than names in calendars. In 1970s Mexico, for instance, devotion to St. Christopher did not decline after the liturgical changes. Instead, it adapted. Entire neighborhoods still organized processions in his honor, especially in regions with high immigration rates, places where fathers, sons, and daughters left for the United States on long, uncertain journeys. Mothers would light candles under his statue. Children would kiss his image before their relatives boarded a bus north. The same was true in parts of the Philippines, where jeepney drivers began to treat St. Christopher as a kind of co-pilot. He was not merely a holy figure, he was part of the vehicle, painted in vivid colors on bumpers and windshields, sometimes smiling, sometimes fierce, often shown waist deep in water, clutching a staff or carrying a child. Here, Christopher's image did something doctrine could not. It humanized risk. It transformed the randomness of the road into something that could be seen, touched, and, even if only symbolically, trusted. In Eastern Europe, his imagery took a different turn. Where state atheism had tried to erase religious identity, St. Christopher often survived underground, not in churches, but in homes, etched into belt buckles, hidden behind pantry shelves, burned into wood panels by grandfathers who remembered the time before. There's a peculiar strength in figures who survive by omission, by being too small to notice, too common to eliminate. Christopher became that, not a saint of the church, a saint of the street, and yet the church never entirely gave him up. His removal from the universal calendar was not a condemnation, but a redirection. The Vatican made it clear that veneration of St. Christopher was not banned, and that local calendars were free to retain his feast, and many did. In Croatia, in Brazil, in regions of Spain and rural Italy, July 25th remained his day, even if it no longer belonged to the global rhythm of Catholic life. This split created an unusual duality. There were now two versions of St. Christopher: the question sang quietly, set aside by scholars, and the remembered sentence changed in the hearts of millions. It's a kind of tension that happens often in church history, between the need to curate and the need to connect, between the hierarchy of ideas and the democracy of memory. And so, Christopher kept walking through border towns, across oceans, into the minds of those who didn't care whether he was fact or fiction. Only that he stood for something comforting, the one who carried others, the one who never stopped. There's another reason why St. Christopher endured. It has less to do with legend and more to do with the nature of travel itself. Travel, in human experience, is often where the sacred and the profane meet. You prepare, you worry, you carry things, you leave others behind. You look for signs, you encounter the unknown. In ancient times, travelers prayed not only to God, but to gods of the crossroads: Hecate, Hermes, Janus. In many ways, St. Christopher inherited this tradition. He became, within Christian logic, what the ancients had already intuited, that journeys needed guardians, but not lofty ones, helpful ones, not theologies, companions. St. Christopher represented, in miniature, what many religious figures forget: he was not a ruler of the path. He was someone who walked it, carried weight, waded through water, and in doing so, became something even non-Catholics could relate to. By the late 20th century, Christopher's image had reached new domains. The space age brought its own perils, and astronauts, some devout, some simply superstitious, brought tiny medals of him aboard space missions. Not officially, quietly, in the corner of a toolkit, under a glove, in the lining of a pocket, not because they expected miracles, but because they wanted memory, the same way a sailor might tuck a photograph of his family into a waterproof pouch. It wasn't about safety in a literal sense. It was about presence in the most dangerous, uncertain environments, on roads, at sea, in the air. Even in orbit, Christopher was invoked, not for glory, but for continuity, a reminder that someone had carried you once, and perhaps now it was your turn to carry someone else, even if that someone was a child, or a cause, or just a belief that you'd get through the storm. In recent years, his Catholic identity has splintered and evolved. Debates about saints have returned, but in different forms. Some question the very idea of canonized figures. Others seek new, modern saints, victims of war, defenders of justice, those who lived humble but impactful lives in obscurity. But among all this, the figure of Saint Christopher lingers. He is rarely on headlines, never on theological panels, but always, somehow, nearby, because the need he answers the desire to feel accompanied in the unknown. It's timeless. It is what makes his story persist, even when stripped of its historical basis, even when the documents don't align, even when feast days are reassigned, liturgies rewritten, calendars rearranged somehow. St. Christopher remains in the fog, in the motion, in the reach. There's something else. 2. A quiet reversal. Over time, many have begun to interpret the legend of Christopher differently. As a man who carried Christ, but as a metaphor for the act of carrying itself. That to carry others in suffering or love or burden is itself a sacred act. That crossing waters for someone else is the very definition of spiritual labor. That strength is not heroic when observed from afar, but intimate when offered up close. That perhaps Christ didn't choose Christopher randomly. Perhaps it was always about what he symbolized, about being human in the most necessary way, sturdy, steady, present. So, why was St. Christopher removed from the calendar? Because his story couldn't be proven, because it grew too large for the historians, and too vague for the theologians, because, in the end, the Church decided to narrow its focus. But why is St. Christopher still everywhere? Because people still travel, because people still worry, because people still carry others, still long to be carried, because in every journey there's a moment when we look up, look ahead, and ask, quietly, for a companion. And Christopher, no matter how forgotten by the scholars, still answers, not in words, but in presence, not in proof, but in the echo of every footstep taken in faith. In faith, not all saints begin with a story. Some begin with a box. It was 1802, in the small Scasa town of Civitanova, Italy. A work crew was clearing part of the ancient Roman catacombs under the church of St. Priscilla. These catacombs, quiet, winding, airless, had long ago been forgotten by time, their tunnels sealed with stone and memory. But now, renewed interest in relics had brought teams back underground, armed with flickering lanterns and the heavy scent of expectation. One tomb, in particular, was different. It was marked with 3 faded terracotta tiles, pieced together, like a puzzle. On them, scratched in crude Latin, were the words, Pax tecum Philomena, peace be with you, Philomena. And just beneath the name, a series of symbols, an anchor, 2 arrows, a palm branch topped to the eyes of the faithful. These were not just carvings, they were a cipher. The anchor suggested steadfast faith. The arrows hinted at martyrdom. The palm branch had long been a symbol of sainthood and heavenly reward. There were no historical records about Philomena, no written martyrdom, no known feast day, no biography, no church documents, nothing. She was, in all recorded history up to that point, blank slate. But that emptiness was exactly what made her so powerful. In the absence of a story, people would write their own. By the time the remains were transferred to Magnano del Cardinale in southern Italy later that year, they were already becoming a sensation. The bones were said to be remarkably preserved. The tiles, simple, cracked, almost accidental, had an aura of divine coincidence. It was the kind of discovery the church hadn't seen in generations. A complete martyr, sealed by time, uncorrupted by tampering, delivered directly into the present like a gift. Within a few years, local clergy were reporting miracles. A woman healed of paralysis after praying to Philomena. A child cured of a fever after touching the sarcophagus. A priest whose eyesight returned after dedicating a mass in her honor. None of this was officially sanctioned, but none of it was discouraged either, because in that early 19th century Italy, the church walked a delicate line between doctrine and devotion. Saints were not merely historical figures. They were spiritual conduits, anchors for the people. When the political wind shifted or the Pope's authority was threatened, saints became bridges. They connected people to the sacred without requiring deep study or literacy. And Philomena, precisely because no one knew her to be anything to anyone. It wasn't long before devotion to Saint Philomena spread far beyond her little sanctuary. In Magnano, by 1835, a French priest named Jean-Marie, later canonized as Saint John, Vianney claimed to have received a miraculous healing through her intercession. His endorsement changed everything. Vianney was no ordinary parish priest. He was a spiritual celebrity in France, famous for his ascetic lifestyle, his endless hours in the confessional, and his emotional sermons. When he spoke, people listened. He called Philomena his dear little saint, built a shrine in her honor, offered masses for her, sent relics across France. With that, her popularity exploded. Confraternities were established in her name. Relics, authentic or otherwise, began appearing in distant cities. Churches dedicated to her were built in New York, Dublin, and even as far as Sri Lanka by the mid-19th century. She was the subject of hundreds of reported miracles, many documented in writing, others whispered among the poor. And yet Philomena had no feast day on the official liturgical calendar, no entry in the Martyrology, no record in Roman history, no trace in early Christian texts. Her entire existence, her name, her symbols, her bones rested on 3 tiles and the strength of belief. She was not a saint because the church said she was. She was a saint because people needed her to be. It's worth pausing here, because in this quiet tension between belief and bureaucracy, we see something essential about how saints are made. Not through paperwork, not through councils, but through longing. Philomena became a mirror, a martyr of the imagination. Young women saw her as a protector of purity and promise. Children saw her as a comforter of fear. Priests saw her as a vessel for spiritual healing in a skeptical age. And lay people, especially the poor, and sick, on her a saint who had bypassed the bureaucracy entirely, a direct connection to heaven, untainted by politics. The church, initially cautious, began to relent. In 1837, Pope Gregory XVI gave her name in formal recognition, allowing local veneration. Her popularity grew even more. By 1855, over 2,000 churches worldwide had requested relics of her bones. She became a kind of grassroots saintizing from the soil of popular devotion rather than the marble of Vatican halls. But what happens when the story becomes too big for the silence? Spelt on. In 1961, after years of internal review and historical scrutiny, the Vatican quietly removed Saint Philomena from the official liturgical calendar. The reasoning was subtle, almost bureaucratic. No evidence of her martyrdom, no reliable historical texts, no verified records of her existence. In short, was no proof. She hadn't been canonized in the formal sense anyway. Her title had been allowed, not bestowed. And so, the decision was made, not to condemn her, not to erase her, but to place her in a kind of theological, quiet room where her cult could continue. Unofficially, outside the spotlight. But this did not sit well with her devotees, especially those whose lives she had supposedly touched. In rural Italy, parishioners continued to call her La Santarella, the little saint. In Brazil, her name remained painted above doorways and on roadside shrines. In America, particularly among immigrant communities. Philomena remained as popular as ever. Her statues never left. Her prayer cards never disappeared. Her medals continued to be sold in church shops and flea markets alike, because her story had never really been about history. It had been about need, and need, unlike doctrine, cannot be rescinded by decree. By the end of the 20th century, a strange thing had happened. Saint Philomena erased from the books had become more alive than ever in certain corners of the world. She became the patron of the erased, the forgotten, the uncertain, a figure invoked not in great cathedrals, but in whispered prayers, in hospital rooms, in family kitchens, in the quiet, trembling before bad news. She was, in many ways, the opposite of official sainthood. No verified miracles, no authenticated writings, no traceable life, and yet she endured, because Philomena filled a void, a name with no history, onto which history's leftovers could cling. And so she remains, a saint for the undocumented, a martyr for those whose stories were never written, a holy figure who perhaps never lived, but who nevertheless continues to live in the minds of those who call her name. To understand how a saint with no story became one of the most venerated figures of the 19th century, we must look at the church not as a monolith of rules, but as a patchwork of human longing, clerical ambition, and quiet theological contradictions. Saint Philomena emerged not from the top down, but from the bottom up. Inverse canonization, driven by desperate prayer, grassroots miracles, and the unrelenting persistence of ordinary believers. Her rise happened during a time when the Catholic Church was facing enormous challenges, particularly in Europe. The Napoleonic Wars had devastated the continent. Churches were looted, monasteries disbanded, and religious institutions seen by many as relics of a feudal age. In France, the Revolution had violently severed the tie between church and state. And in Italy, the Pope had become a political prisoner more than once. Across the Catholic world, faith was struggling to survive, not just secularism, but cynicism. People didn't just need miracles, they needed someone new. Philomena offered that. She had no political baggage, no association with corrupt bishops, no complicated theological writings to parse. Just a name scratched on 3 tiles, a box of bones, and a feeling. A quiet, comforting feeling that perhaps, somewhere, somehow, the heavens were still listening. By the time Philomena's popularity reached its peak in the mid to late 19th century, she had taken on a remarkable range of roles. She was called the patroness of infants, children, and youth, of impossible causes, of desperate situations, of purity, of healing, of hope. But in the background, slow tide of concern was rising among church historians and theologians, because by then, the church had begun to modernize its processes of beatification and canonization. New rules required thorough documentation, verification of miracles, historical proof, eyewitness accounts, and Philomena, for all her popularity, failed on every front. There was no documentation, no birth date, no death date, no contemporaries, no original martyrdom account, only legends, and even those were late arrivals. One such legend, notably elaborate, emerged in the 1830s and claimed to come from a private revelation, a nun's vision of Philomena's life. According to this vision, Philomena had been a Greek princess who pledged her virginity to God and was martyred by the Roman Emperor Diocletian after refusing to marry him. She was scourged, drowned with an anchor around her neck, and shot with arrows, yet miraculously survived each torment until finally being beheaded. The story was dramatic, suspiciously so. It contained every symbol. From her tomb tiles, the anchor, the arrows, the palm branching mirrored many martyrdom tales of the early Christian era, but it lacked one crucial thing: any historical anchor point. The narrative couldn't be traced to any early Christian source. It didn't appear in any martyrologies, church fathers' writings, or Roman histories. It came from a vision, not a record Yet, that story stuck. It was easy to preach, easy to believe. It resonated especially with women and young girls who saw in Philomena a kind of spiritual sister yielding. Brave, pure, Philomena's surge in popularity coincided with another subtle shift, the rise of what could be called consumer Catholicism. Relics had become widespread. Holy medals were being mass-produced. Prayer, books, and chaplets were printed in dozens of languages. In this environment, Philomena became not just a saint, but a brand. Her image was sweet, serene, and often depicted with youthful innocence. She became a bestseller on holy cards. Her chaplets structured similarly to the rosary gained popularity, despite no formal liturgical status, and her shrine in Magnano del Cardinale saw pilgrims from across Europe and the Americas. For many local priests, invoking Philomena brought revival. Church attendance rose, confessions increased, donations flowed. She was a source of local pride, especially in rural towns that felt forgotten by Rome, and so Philomena thrived, not by decree, but by demand. But the Church has a long memory. By the 20th century, its concern over Philomena's origins was mounting among Vatican officials. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s ushered in a wave of reforms aimed at modernizing the Church and purifying its practices from superstition and spoof for sentimental devotion. The Council's guiding principle was ressourcement, a return to the original sources, and Philomena had no sources, no manuscript, no inscription beyond those 3 dusty tiles, no record in the earliest Christian liturgies. Her name did not appear in the oldest Roman canon, nor was there any trace of her among the Duplication Martyrum, the Church's earliest catalog of saints and martyrs. What she had was faith, but not facts, and faith, in an age of theological tightening, was no longer enough. In 1961, the Sacred Congregation of Rites removed her feast day from the liturgical calendar, not as a condemnation, but as a quiet correction. They did not ban her veneration. They simply stepped away from it. They reclassified her relics, discontinued public readings of her story in official masses, and reminded the faithful that saints like doctrine must have roots in verified truth. Too many. It felt like an erasure, but to others, it was simply the closing of an era, one where saints could emerge from silence, thrive on belief, and remain despite the lack of evidence. The shrine in Magnano remained open. The pilgrims still came, and the prayers, whispered in every language imaginable, never really stopped. One reason the Church has always been cautious about private revelations is that they are hard to control. They do not unfold on paper. They grow in hearts, in voices, in candles lit for the dying, in promises made during long nights, in hopes too fragile to speak aloud. Philomena had no official story, so her story became everyone's. She became a canvas for private longing, especially among those who felt unworthy of more official saints. People who saw their needs as too ordinary, their grief as too small, their sins as too quiet to them. Philomena wasn't just a saint, she was a secret, a small rebellion against the polished, official Church, a whispered name when the louder ones failed. The contradiction here is both profound and deeply human. The Vatican, as guardian of doctrine, must enforce historical rigor. Saints canonized today undergo decades of scrutiny, involving theologians, historians, and scientists. Their miracles must be verified, their virtues examined, their lives documented. Philomena had none of this, yet in many ways she fulfilled the role of a saint more completely than most. She inspired confession, she comforted the sick, she lifted the weary, she created pilgrimage, prayer, and reform. Is it possible then that the truth of a saint lies not in their past, but in their present? If so many were healed by her name, comforted by her image, or drawn back to faith by her story, does her historical absence matter? Or is there a deeper truth in the longing itself? In the hope she represented, in the silence she answered. Even today, Philomena remains popular among certain groups. She is venerated in traditionalist Catholic circles, in immigrant churches, and in homes where children still carry her medal around their neck. Her chaplet is still prayed. Her shrine still receives thousands of visitors a year, and in each of those moments, the question remains suspended in the quiet. What if a saint doesn't need a history to be real? What if the desire for holiness, however misguided, creates its own kind of sacred ground? What if believing itself is enough? When the name Philomena was quietly erased from the general Roman calendar in 1961, it was not followed by a public declaration or an announcement from the pulpit. There was no sweeping decree, no dramatic renunciation, no ceremonial removal of statues. This was subtle, like a candle allowed to burn out on its own, rather than snuffed in protest. The name faded from the calendar, but not from memory. The reasons for her removal, as discussed in academic and ecclesiastical circles, had little to do with scandal and everything to do with a deep, evolving discomfort. The historical method had entered the sanctuary. The church, always balancing faith and reason, had begun to lean more heavily toward documentation, toward sources, towards what could be verified. This shift solidified during and after the Second Vatican Council. It's meant to protect doctrine from myth and to ensure that the stories being passed down were rooted in discernible truth. Philomena, for all her popularity and sincerity of devotion, could not survive that scrutiny. There were no reliable written sources, no contemporary witnesses, no liturgical traditions rooted in antiquity, and yet Ski had been revered as if she were one of the earliest martyrs of the church. Her name was spoken in novenas, her image adorned altars, her relics were placed beside those of saints whose histories were firmly rooted in the early Christian centuries. The church's decision was not an act of punishment. It was not a disavowal of the miracles attributed to her, nor a condemnation of those who loved her. It was simply an adjustment, a reminder that popular devotion does not always translate into formal recognition. But for many believers, the church's careful footnote felt like a kind of betrayal. How could something so deeply cherished be quietly dismissed? Was their faith misplaced? Were the healings and answered prayers suddenly invalid? This dissonance, the tension between institutional skepticism and personal belief, has long existed within religious traditions. Saints like Philomena sit at the border between formal theology and lived experience. And when those borders shift, it raises questions not just about saints, but about the nature of belief itself. In Magnano del Cardinale, where Philomena's relics had been enshrined since 1805, the local community felt this shift with more than theological concern. The town had built itself around her. The church bearing her name was not just a site of worship, it was a focal point of local identity, tourism, and pride. People had grown up with stories of the miracles that occurred there. The blind woman who could see again, the child cured of epilepsy, the sailor who survived a violent storm after praying to Philomena in the late 19th century. Even Pope Pius IX, who had once visited the shrine while he was still a bishop, attributed a personal healing to Philomena. He called her the wonder worker of the 19th century. Decades later, that same pope would launch major structural changes to the church. But for a time, he was just another pilgrim, kneeling at her tomb. What was the church to do with this contradiction? How could it balance the obvious spiritual fruit of her cult with the complete absence of documentation? The answer, as it often is with bureaucracy, was gentle ambiguity. While she was removed from the general Roman calendar, her cult was not officially suppressed. shrines were allowed to remain. Private devotion was not forbidden. Dioceses were permitted to celebrate her feast day, especially where there was strong local tradition. In this way, Philomena became a kind of unofficial saint venerated, not through the processes of canon law, but through persistence. If one were to walk the aisles of her church today, they would find her story written not in ancient marble, but in countless small gestures, candles flickering beside statues, worn-out prayer cards folded into missals, silver expodos nailed to the walls, teeny tokens of gratitude shaped like arms, legs, hearts, and lungs, each representing a healed ailment or a returned favor in one corner. A rusted crutch leans against a pew left behind by someone who walked out without it in another. A wedding veil drapes over the statue's feet, offering from a woman who had prayed for love and found it. These artifacts, unrecorded in any official Vatican register, constitute their own kind of canon, a living record, a tapestry of belief woven from whispered promises and unspoken fears. What makes Philomena's story so compelling isn't her biography. She has none. It's what people needed her to be: a protector of the powerless, a listener to the ignored, a saint for the unremarkable prayers, the ones offered not in cathedrals, but in kitchens, in hospital waiting rooms, in the quiet loneliness of night. In a way, Philomena's absence from church history reveals as much about the church as her presence once did. Her rise shows how devotion can grow from the ground up. Her faller's soft disappearance shows how institutions try to manage that growth. And at the heart of it lies an uncomfortable but enduring truth. Sometimes, history forgets, not out of malice, but out of caution. Saints are meant to be models of faith, not puzzles to be solved. And Philomena, for all her mystery, fit that role perfectly till she didn't. The church was not wrong to apply rigor. In fact, the desire to maintain historical integrity is noble and necessary. But what it couldn't fully account for was the deeply human need to find the sacred in the forgotten, the anonymous, the unverifiable. Centuries ago, during the time of the early church, many martyrs were buried without names. Their graves were marked only by symbols of fish, a dove, a palm frond. The faithful did not always know who they were, but they honored them all the same. They lit lamps, they sang hymns, they built chapels over their tombs. In some ways, Philomena's story brings the church full circle. She is one of those nameless martyrs, rediscovered, renamed, reimagined. Her canonization was accidental. Her popularity was a cultural phenomenon. Her removal was a correction, and her legacy is still unfolding. Perhaps the question is not whether she ever lived. Perhaps the more important question is why so. Many people needed her too. Why do some names disappear and others rise, like songs no one wrote, but everyone sings? Why do some lives, whether real or imagined, become vessels for grace? What happens when the church must choose between what is true and what is beloved? And what does it mean when belief persists, even in silence? Today, you won't find Philomena's name on the Vatican's official list of saints, but you might still find her image in the back of her grandmother's Bible. You might hear her name whispered in a hospital corridor. You might see a chapel to her, standing quietly on a hillside, filled with flowers and no fanfare. She is not canonized. She is not forgotten. She lives somewhere in between, a saint of uncertainty, a patron of unresolved things, a reminder that not everything sacred needs a stamp of approval, and that sometimes what we believe matters more than what we know. Long before the church began trimming its calendar, long before PayPal commissions quietly retired certain feast days, there was a tale so extravagant, so numerically absurd, and yet so widely beloved that it defied logic for over 1,000 years. It was the story of Saint Ursula, Virgin Martyr, and, allegedly, the spiritual leader of 11,000 young women who followed her into death. You may never have heard of her, or if you have, it might have been in passing, in the name of a school, an old cathedral, or a crumbling mosaic in a forgotten church in Cologne. But for centuries, Ursula was everywhere. She was invoked by nuns, taught in convents, etched into stained glass, and painted into the margins of illuminated manuscripts. Her feast day, October 21st, was once marked with song and procession, yet today you would struggle to find a parish that still honors her. The calendar no longer bears her name. Her cult has grown quiet. Her number 11,000 has been quietly questioned, corrected, even ridiculed. And her story, well, it dissolved not with scandal, but with silence. So how did it begin? As with many medieval saints, the details are foggy, cloaked in a haze of oral tradition, translation, errors, and the slow embellishment of time. What we do know is that the earliest written references to Saint Ursula date back to around the 9th century, some 500 years after she supposedly lived and died. Even then, the records were vague. A stone inscription in the church of Saint Ursula in Cologne made mention of a group of virgins who were martyred nearby. Their number, undetermined. Perhaps a handful, perhaps a dozen, but somewhere between the carving of that inscription and the compilation of later medieval hagiographies, that modest band of martyrs multiplied first into the dozens, then hundreds, and finally into the astonishing, near mythical figure of 11,000. Where did that number come from? Was it a copying error? A mistranslation? One popular theory suggests that the original Latin inscription reads Xi MV, intended to mean 11 martyred virgins. But as the story was copied and recopied, those letters were misunderstood. Teen was read not as martyrs, but as millia, thousands. 11 martyred virgins became 11,000. It is the kind of error that feels like a joke now. But in the Middle Ages, when literacy was rare and reverence often outweighed research, such a mistake could birth a cult. And what a cult it became. By the High Middle Ages, Ursula's story had grown into an epic in its most popular version. She was a British princess who vowed to remain a virgin and made a pilgrimage across Europe with 11,000 companions, all of them young women similarly consecrated to God. The group traveled to Rome, stopping in various cities, converting people along the way. When they reached Cologne, however, disaster struck. The Huns were laying siege to the city, and they captured the entire company. The Huns offered Ursula a deal. She alone could live if she agreed to marry their leader. She refused, and so, one by one, all 11,000 were slaughtered. It's the kind of story that defies logic and historical possibility. No army, not even the Huns, would pause to slay 11,000 young women by hand. No city could bury them. No culture, not even the violence of the 4th century, would record such a thing without leaving more tangible traces. And yet, for a millennium, it was taken as truth. Why? Because the story resonated in a world where virginity was exalted as the pinnacle of holiness for women. Ursula became an icon in a society constantly threatened by war and famine. Her refusal to submit, her calm acceptance of martyrdom, was the ultimate act of faith. She embodied the ideal woman of the church, pure, brave, and willing to die for what she believed. The cults spread like fire. Churches across Europe were dedicated to her. Pilgrims flocked to Cologne, where relics, coals, bones, fragments of supposed clothing were displayed behind glass and gold. Artists painted her surrounded by throngs of serene, haloed women. In one fresco, you can count hundreds of them, arranged in orderly rows, their eyes cast upward in peaceful surrender. There were prayers written to her and songs. Her name was spoken alongside the Virgin Mary's in some convents. Her image graced the personal devotional books of queens. And still, no one seemed to mind that the story was impossible. That is, till the Reformation. As Protestant scholars began re-evaluating Catholic traditions, the cult of saints came under intense scrutiny. Reformers were quick to point out the lack of scriptural support for such practices. To them, saints like Ursula represented the excesses of medieval religiosity, faith-based, more on legend than scripture, though the Church resisted these attacks for centuries. The criticism lingered, and by the time the 20th century arrived, with its emphasis on historical accuracy and academic rigor, Ursula's story began to falter. Modern historians revisited the inscriptions. They reviewed the earliest manuscripts. They examined the bones in Cologne, many of which turned out to belong to men, animals, or children, even among church historians. The story of Ursula was now seen more as pious fiction than historical fact. So in 1969, touring a reform of the liturgical calendar, the Church made a decision. Ursula's feast day would no longer be universally celebrated. She was not decanonized. No such process exists. But she was quietly set aside, her story no longer encouraged, her legacy gently folded into history's deeper pockets. But stories, especially the ones we want to believe, rarely vanish just because someone tells us they're false. In Cologne, the Church of St. Ursula still stands. Inside is a room called the Golden Chamber, filled with the skulls and bones of what are said to be the 11,000 virgins. The walls are decorated with intricate patterns made entirely from bones. Femurs form arches, skulls are stacked like bricks. It is a macabre mosaic of devotion. And while most scholars agree that these are likely the remains of various people gathered from nearby Roman cemeteries, candles are lit, prayers are whispered, not for 11,000, maybe not even for one, but for something older, harder to erase. The idea that some stories are too beloved to be corrected. The tale of Saint Ursula raises the same questions that lingered around Philomena. What happens when faith collides with fact? Can a story that is almost certainly untrue still be meaningful? Does the erasure of a feast day mean the erasure of belief? And what, in the end, do we lose when we insist that every mystery be solved? Perhaps these saints, who faded from calendars, didn't vanish because they were false, but because they were too poetic for the modern world, too symbolic, too embroidered with medieval imagination. They belonged to an era when faith didn't need footnotes and wonder was a valid form of knowledge. And in the quiet rooms of old churches in bone-filled chapels and forgotten altars, their stories still wait, not for validation, but for remembrance. The legend of Saint Ursula and her 11,000 companions may seem like a relic of a more credulous age, a medieval fable that lost its footing in the modern world. But if you follow the quiet trail of this story deeper, past the layers of mistaken numerals and poetic martyrdom, you'll begin to see something else, a different kind of history, not the grand, sweeping kind, but one composed of quiet misunderstandings, community rituals, and 1,000 small acts of belief. The Golden Chamber of Cologne is not a grand basilica adorned with Renaissance grandeur. It is modest in size, though rich in the visual language of devotion. Its walls are truly covered in human bones, not bones hidden respectfully in ossuaries or behind sealed reliquaries, but arranged into deliberate, visible patterns, arches, rosettes, borders, and symbols. Skulls and femurs, vertebrae and ribs, all carefully displayed like precious materials. For centuries, this chamber was believed to hold the remains of St. Ursula's companions, the martyred virgins of the legend. But if one looks closely, the inconsistencies begin to show. Some of the skulls are clearly from elderly individuals. Others belong to men, a few even to children. Some bones are from animals. Archaeologists have gently pointed out these facts, carefully noting that many of the remains likely came from a Roman era cemetery disturbed during during later construction, but to the faithful, especially in earlier centuries, this didn't matter. They weren't looking for proof. They were looking for presence. The chamber was never intended to be a forensic archive. It was a visual sermon, a testimony carved in bone, a physical place where myth met material. Every pattern formed from these relics was a way of continuing the story, of keeping the legend alive, not just in books or sermons, but in the very architecture of daily worship. And there's something deeply human in that. It's easy to forget that medieval people, often portrayed as credulous, were not unaware of contradictions. They lived in a world full of visible inconsistencies, strange relics, multiple true versions of saints, clashing stories, and yet they accepted these paradoxes not as threats, but as mysteries. Mystery, in fact, was central to the religious imagination of the time. It wasn't meant to be solved. It was meant to be revered. In this mindset, Ursula's 11,000 companions didn't need to be historically verified. Their sheer number, if anything, elevated their story from mere fact to divine spectacle. It wasn't a statistic. It was a metaphor, a symbol of boundless devotion, of overwhelming sacrifice, of a femininity that transcended domestic roles and entered the realm, the sacred, through martyrdom. This symbolic thinking shaped the way saints like Ursula were remembered, not as historical figures with birth dates and biographies, but as cosmic witnesses to faith. So how then did Ursula's legend evolve across the centuries? Let's trace the growth of her myth. In the earliest forms of the story, Ursula is unnamed. The oldest inscription found in Colonna, 4th or 5th century Latin, text refers only to a group of virgins martyred under Roman rule. No numbers, no names, no details. But by the 9th century, the name Ursula begins to appear. Then come the numbers, first 11, then gradually climbing as the story is copied, told, embroidered. Monastic scribes, especially those in the women's convents of medieval Europe, played a significant role in expanding the narrative. Ursula became a model for female sanctity, independent and brave. Her story was copied into books of hours, devotional manuals, and saints' calendars. She was especially revered in Germany, France, and the Low Countries, where her feast day became a highlight of the liturgical year. In the 13th century, the legend expanded again, this time incorporating miraculous elements. As angels appear in Ursula's dreams, her companions convert pagan armies, the Pope himself blesses her pilgrimage. The massacre becomes a sacred sacrifice, echoing the Passion of Christ. By this time, the story had transcended its Roman origins entirely. It was no longer a tale of historical martyrdom, but a medieval spiritual epic, and still her numbers grew. Some manuscripts list not 11,000, but 11,011. Others say 11,500. Some accounts add detailed names, backstories, and even geographic origins for her companions, giving them individual lives. Despite their collective anonymity, it became a kind of devotional expansionism. But there was one detail that endured across almost every version: the city of Cologne. Cologne, one of the oldest cities in Germany, embraced Ursula's legend as part of its civic and spiritual identity. Her story was not just a tale told in churches. It became a cornerstone of Cologne's medieval identity. In fact, the city's coat of arms, 11 black flame-like drops, represent Ursula's companions. Pilgrims came from all over Europe to visit her shrine. The relics, scattered across multiple churches, were objects of intense veneration. The presence of so many bones, all attributed to her story, only reinforced belief. It didn't matter whether the remains could be authenticated. What mattered was their participation in the legend, and the legend served a purpose. Women, especially those in religious life, a figure to emulate. Gave the city of Cologne a spiritual magnetism. It gave the church another symbol of sacrifice, obedience, and resistance. But by the Renaissance, as humanist scholars began to prioritize historical accuracy and textual scrutiny. Doubts began to surface, and these doubts, once introduced, proved hard to silence. Fast forward to the 16th century. The Reformation is spreading. Protestant critics of the Catholic Church, such as Martin Luther and John Calvin, denounced the cult of saints as superstitious, unbiblical, and ripe with fraud. Stories like Ursula's are held up as examples of religious absurdity. The Catholic Church, while defending its traditions, begins to feel the pressure to clarify, codify, and, in some cases, correct. And this brings us to the modern age. By the 20th century, the Church initiated a wide review of its liturgical calendar. The Second Vatican Council 196-21965 and its reforms included a deep examination of the saints officially celebrated across the Catholic world. One of the outcomes was the 1969 revision of the General Roman Calendar, quiet but significant reshuffling of sacred time, saints for whom no historical evidence could be found, particularly those with contradictory or purely legendary biographies, were quietly removed from the universal calendar. This didn't mean they were unsainted, but it meant their feast days were no longer required to be celebrated in liturgical worship. Local traditions could continue to honor them, but they would not be upheld as global examples of Catholic sanctity. Saint Ursula was among those removed, and so the story that once drew pilgrims from across Europe faded from global view. But did it vanish? Not quite in Cologne. The Church of St. Ursula still holds Mass on her feast day. The Golden Chamber remains open to visitors. Schoolgirls named Ursula still walk past murals and memorials to their namesake. The legend lives on, not as historical certainty, but as spiritual memory. You might find her in an old missal or a dusty prayer card. You might see her image in an old convent library. You might hear her name whispered in a museum. Puzzled over by a curator trying to reconcile 11,000 martyrs with a single medieval inscription. And perhaps that's where Saint Ursula belongs now, in the sharp light of modern history, but in the soft shadows of memory where fact and faith quietly overlap. What does it mean to remember someone whose story might not be true? Is it erasure to remove them from a calendar, or simply honesty? And in the echoing stillness of old churches where candles flicker beside bones that may or may not be hers, can memory exist without verification? There is a quiet kind of erosion that happens not through destruction, but through disinterest. Soft vanishing that unfolds when attention shifts elsewhere. That's what happened to St. Ursula through censorship or dramatic scandal, but through a slow change in what counted as believable. Yet, even in her fading, Ursula leaves a trace. Let's go back to the bones. Inside the Church of St. Ursula in Cologne, the Golden Chamber remains unchanged in its mission: to remember. The bones may not belong to virgins martyred by Huns, but they belonged to someone. Roman citizens, most likely. Possibly victims of an epidemic or war. Maybe ordinary people who lived and died quietly, their names lost to time. Their remains disturbed by centuries of building and rebuilding, but through some twist of devotion and narrative need, they became part of something larger. They were gathered, arranged, presented, not as scientific specimens, but as sacred symbols. They became saints by proximity, martyrs by association, and this reveals something profound about medieval Christianity. It wasn't always about individual biography. It was about witness. A person could become meaningful in death simply by participating in a story that gave their suffering a purpose. Even today, some visitors to the church feel moved in it by historical certainty, but by the quiet dignity of the space, the way the bones form crosses and vines, the way silence sits in the air like dust in a world increasingly obsessed with authentication. The Golden Chamber remains defiantly symbolic. But what does this mean for Ursula? Was she ever real? The answer is, possibly, perhaps not in the way you expect. Scholars now suspect that the original reference to 11 martyred virgins was likely a simple, local memory of persecution, maybe in Roman Cologne, maybe in nearby Trier or Mainz. The Latin abbreviation XIMV could have meant 11 martyred virgins, gay, but it could also have meant martyrs of the 11th month, or even Ximena and Valeria. If read differently, in medieval script, where ink faded and abbreviations were fluid, it was all too easy for a simple phrase to evolve into an epic. Once the number 11 became 11,000 whether by scribal error, Chaonic flourish, or devotional excess, the legend expanded rapidly. And like a snowball down a hill, it collected more names, more miracles, more details with every retelling. But here's the thing, even if Ursula was never one person, her legend was never about one person. It was about an idea. In a world where women were often confined to domestic roles, Ursula represented a counter-narrative. She was educated, noble, and brave. She traveled. She defied a marriage. She led others. And she died not for romance, but for faith. She became a model for spiritual strength in female form. This is why so many medieval women's communities embraced her story. Convents named themselves after her. Nuns copied her legend by hand. Girls were baptized in her name. Artisans carved her face into altarpieces and tapestries in the 16th century. A religious order, the Ursulines, was founded in her name. They would go on to establish schools for girls across Europe and beyond. Through education, they carried on Ursula's legacy, even as her feast day quietly disappeared from official calendars. Isn't it strange? A possibly fictional saint, erased for lack of evidence, still helped transform the lives of real women for centuries. And yet, Ursula is not alone in this. Dozens of saints were quietly removed from the general Roman calendar in 1969. Some were legendary figures like Christopher and George, whose dragon-slaying feats were deemed unlikely by modern standards. Others were local martyrs, remembered only in small villages or old missals. Their removal wasn't meant to be punitive. It was a pastoral decision, a desire to streamline the calendar and focus on those saints whose lives were historically verifiable. But it had consequences in communities where those saints had been central to local identity. Their disappearance felt like a quiet betrayal, a rewriting of memory, a suggestion that stories once treasured were now convenient. And this raises a deeper question. What counts as true in sacred history? There is a kind of truth that doesn't depend on dates or documents. A story like Ursula's, even if constructed from errors and metaphors, can still carry weight. It tells us what people wanted to believe, what they feared, what they hoped for. That's valuable in its own right. When a community chooses to remember someone, real or not, shapes identity. It carves meaning into ordinary life. Feast days become pauses in the calendar. Relics become reasons to gather. Legends become lessons whispered across generations. Saints, sent, in this sense, are less about their own lives and more about the lives they touch. So even if Ursula never lived long enough to become part of European cultural memory, that's no small thing. Let's return for a moment to the act of erasure. Removing a saint from the calendar isn't like burning a book. It's more like not reprinting it. The story still exists, but it fades. It falls out of common use, out of liturgy, out of memory, but not completely. In Cologne, every October 21st, there is still a quiet mass held in her honor. Tourists walk past murals of her on city walls. Historians continue to study her legend, not because they expect to find facts, but because they want to understand why it mattered. Ursula's story may no longer be preached from every pulpit, but it still hums in the background of European religious history, like a half-forgotten song, that's still somehow familiar. And in a way, it's a kind of sainthood too. The Church of St. Ursula still stands. The bones are still there. Gold leaf glints faintly under the dim lights. Tour guides still pause in front of the golden chamber, their voices softening as they describe what may or may not have happened. No one really knows the names of those people whose bones line the walls, but someone does. Not in heaven, not in archives, but in the collective memory of the city. The quiet rituals, the stories whispered in candlelight, the pilgrim who kneels anyway, not because they're certain, but because they feel something. That's what remains, and maybe that's the most interesting kind of history. The one no longer certain, but still remembered. What does it mean when stories outlive their facts? Is a saint less real because her history was scribal error, or more real because people believed anyway? And if memory can persist after calendars have changed, what other legends wait in the dust, quietly refusing to vanish? Before printed Bibles, before Vatican archives, before even the hardened rituals of the early church took shape, there were only stories. Simple, sometimes whispered, sometimes grandiose. Stories that traveled by mouth from village to village, across mountains and monasteries, carried by barefoot monks or told beside flickering hearths. One of those stories, perhaps the most outlandish and enduring, was about a creature, a beast, a monster with wings, and somehow it became a saint. The tale of Saint Margaret of Antioch, often overshadowed today by more prominent names, once stood proudly among the most celebrated narratives in Christendom. Not because it was historically verified, not because her life was recorded with clarity, but because her legend filled a particular space in people's minds, space shaped not by doctrine, but by imagination. She was said to be a virgin martyr, like many others in early Christian hagiography. But her story included something rare, a dragon, not metaphorically, literally, according to the most widespread version of the legend. Margaret was imprisoned for refusing to renounce her faith and marry a Roman governor. While in her cell, the devil appeared to her in the form of a dragon. It swallowed her whole, but the moment it did, the cross she wore burned so fiercely that the creature exploded from within, and Margaret emerged unharmed, scathed, triumphant, and glowing with divine favor. It is, by any modern measure, a fantastical story, but it was believed, revered, replicated for centuries. Let's unravel how a dragon real or not turned a place in the Roman calendar. St. Margaret's cult emerged in the East, likely in what is now modern-day Turkey, sometime around the 3rd or 4th century. But her legend didn't find widespread popularity until it migrated westward during the medieval period, by the 12th century. Her feast, day July 20th, was celebrated across Europe. She became especially beloved in England, where she was one of the 14 Holy Helpers, a group of saints often called upon for protection during illness or spiritual trouble. And yet, she wasn't known for healing. She was known for strength, for resisting temptation, for literally bursting out of the belly of evil. This made her a favorite among young women, especially those who feared childbirth at the time of immense physical danger and social vulnerability. In many medieval texts, Margaret's emergence from the dragon's belly was directly equated with the act of giving birth. She became the patroness of expectant mothers. Midwives even carried small wax figures of her. Laboring women clutched prayers written in her name. Some birthing rooms had Margaret's image carved above the door, as if invoking her would guard the threshold between life and death. Even more curiously, her tale became popular among soldiers, Tana for its martial content, but for its clear depiction of triumph over impossible odds, to endure torment, to emerge victorious. It didn't matter that the story wasn't real. What mattered was that it worked. The church tolerated the dragon. For centuries, in fact, it did more than tolerate, it incorporated it. Illuminated manuscripts show Margaret bursting from the belly of the beast, robes billowing, hair aglow. Churches built altars in her honor. Her name appears in dozens of medieval calendars and breviaries. But by the 20th century, things began to shift. The Second Vatican Council, convened in the early 1960s, aimed to modernize and streamline many aspects of Catholic life. One of its many outcomes was a reevaluation of the saints included on the general Roman calendar, the list of feast days that the Universal Church was expected to observe. The goal wasn't to discredit saints, but to prioritize those whose lives had clearer historical evidence. Saint Margaret didn't make the cut. Her feast day was suppressed. Not abolished, she could still be celebrated locally, but she was quietly removed from the central liturgical calendar. The reason given. Story was apocryphal. There was no verifiable proof of her existence. The details were clearly legendary. And a dragon. Well, that didn't help. But here's the odd thing. Saints like George, who also famously battled a dragon, were allowed to remain on the calendar, albeit with revisions. His story was recast in symbolic terms. The dragon became a metaphor for evil. His historicity, though murky, was given the benefit of the doubt. So why was Margaret treated differently? One reason lies in her association with women's issues, particularly childbirth. As medical science advanced and church teachings became more reserved about saints associated with folk practices, Margaret's image became less useful, less appropriate, less controllable. It's easier to turn a male knight slaying a beast into metaphor than to explain why midwives are chanting prayers to a virgin who burst from a stomach. And so, Margaret's feast day faded from view, not erased, just shelved. This didn't stop devotion to her entirely. In rural parts of Eastern Europe, she remained a household name. In parts of Ethiopia and Eritrea, she is still celebrated with pageantry and pride. Her story continues to be passed down not in catechisms, but in quiet traditions, whispered from grandmother to mother to daughter. So what are we left with? A saint whose story may never have been meant to be literal. A narrative that likely began as metaphor, was embraced as miracle, and was later demoted as myth, and yet mattered for over 1,000 years, for people in pain, for women on the edge of life and death, for believers facing torment. The dragon wasn't just a monster, it was fear, it was agony, it was loneliness, rejection, persecution. And to see someone step out of its mouth, radiant and victorious, that was hope. That was enough. But then comes the question, what do we do with saints like this? Should they be discarded just because their stories strain credibility? Or should we see them as emotional truth expressions of what people needed, not necessarily what happened? Saint Margaret doesn't need to have fought a dragon to be meaningful. What she represents, that moment of emergence, of defiance, of being swallowed and not destroyed, is universally resonant, even today. You might argue she belongs more than ever in a world still shaped by monstrous systems, by hidden violence, by impossible choices. Her story offers a kind of poetic courage, no longer part of the calendar, but never really gone. By the time St. Margaret's name reached the churches of England, her story had already taken on a shape entirely its own, rounded at the edges by countless retellings, adapted to the needs of different places, and folded into the quiet habits of everyday belief. In parish churches, from Norwich to Canterbury, tiny side chapels were dedicated to her name. They were rarely grand, often just a small niche with a candle holder, a wood carving, and perhaps a wall painting of the saint with a cross in hand, poised before the gaping jaws of a curled, serpent-like dragon. Some of these chapels doubled as places for birthing prayers, where women in labor could be quietly blessed before returning home. particular phrase appeared again and again in these spaces, etched in Latin or vernacular script. As Margaret escaped from the belly of the beast, so may you deliver safely from the pains of birth. That single sentence shaped generations of devotion, because it wasn't about miracles. Not really. It was about metaphor that people lived. It was about taking the incomprehensible, the helplessness of childbirth, the looming fear of death, and giving it a shape you could see, a shape you could fight against, a shape you could pray to. It wasn't the church that made St. Margaret powerful. It was the women who whispered her name when no one else would listen. And that may be exactly why the church later tried to silence her. The early church had always existed in tension with popular piety. On the one hand, saints brought people closer to faith. They gave the intangible a face, a story, a voice. On the other hand, when those saints were not officially sanctioned, they posed a problem. By the 12th and 13th centuries, canonization was becoming more centralized. The papacy sought to control which stories were permitted to define sainthood. Miracles needed verification. Lives needed scrutiny. Hagiographies were no longer just inspirational. They were judicial. Saint Margaret's story, as beautiful and beloved as it was, didn't pass the new standards. There was no historical documentation, no verifiable tomb, no contemporaneous record of her trial or death. And that dragon, it didn't help. Yet her popularity surged anyway. During the Crusades, knights carried emblems of St. Margaret alongside those of more martial saints like St. George and St. Maurice. Pilgrims prayed to her on the road to Santiago. Her name appeared on relic lists from France to Iceland. Her legend entered the Golden Legend, the most read book in medieval Europe after the Bible, compiled by Jacobus de Voragine in the 13th century. There, her story took full flight. A noblewoman turned Christian, arrested by a pagan governor, swallowed by Satan in dragon form, and released through the burning power of her faith. No attempt was made to tone it down, because belief wasn't always about accuracy. It was about resonance. In medieval medicine, especially among female healers and midwives, St. Margaret's name became ritualized. One curious text from the late 14th century, known as the Trotula, after the supposed female author, Trotta, of Salerno, describes a birthing charm. A midwife would recite verses about St. Margaret, untying a ribbon, called the girdle of Margaret, around the laboring woman's abdomen. The charm invoked Margaret's escape from the dragon as symbolic aid for the child's exit from the womb. Interestingly, church officials didn't always object. For much of the medieval period, the clergy turned a blind eye to these customs. The people needed saints, and if the stories were strange, well, so were most of the stories in Scripture. But something changed with the rise of scholasticism and the emergence of Renaissance humanism. Suddenly, stories weren't enough. By the 16th century, reformers, both within and outside the Catholic Church, began to question the authenticity of saints like Margaret. Protestant leaders rejected the veneration of saints altogether, viewing them as idolatrous. In response, Catholic leaders became more selective. Saints needed to reflect the rigor of doctrine, the excesses of imagination. And yet, in private, the old stories endured. Women still passed Margaret's tale to their daughters. Midwives still murmured her name during difficult births. In rural villages, feast day processions still honored her with garlands and hymns, even as printed calendars removed her from the central roles. She lived on in the margins. One Italian folktale from the 1700s describes Margaret not with a dragon, but as standing inside a fire calm and unburned. The dragon, in this version, becomes symbolic of the flames, the pain, the destruction that can be endured through unwavering belief. This was no longer a child's fable. It was a woman's survival guide. By the 20th century, the tension had grown. Pope Pius XII, Pope John XXIII, and ultimately Pope Paul VI all pushed for liturgical reforms to align the Church more closely with historical evidence and modern pastoral needs. This culminated in the 1969 revision of the General Roman Calendar, part of the Second Vatican Council's reforms. In this sweeping act, more than 90 saints were removed from the universal calendar, not because they were declared false, but because their histories could not be sufficiently verified. Saint Margaret was one of them. Her feast day, July 20th, was no longer considered mandatory. The reasoning was simple on the surface. Our story lacked historical foundation, but some scholars suggested another motive. Saints, like Margaret, represented a kind of folk spirituality that the modern church wanted to distance itself from stories of dragons, mystical births, and women who overcame male authority through miraculous means. These weren't just outdated, they were difficult to control, but the erasure wasn't complete. In the 2004 Martyrologium Romanum, revised list of saints still acknowledged Margaret, albeit quietly. Local churches were free to honor her. Her name remained carved into stones, painted into ceilings, and whispered by those who remembered in some Eastern Orthodox calendars. Saint Margaret remains firmly in place, oft celebrated as Saint Marina, with identical stories, including the dragon, and in Ethiopia, her feast day is a public celebration. Girls dressed in white gather at churches to chant prayers and retell the moment Margaret emerged from the beast. In a world where many saints remain abstract, Margaret remains embodied, tangible, breathing, radiant in pain, even outside of religion. She lingers in literature. Margaret's dragon tale has been reinterpreted by feminists and folklorists alike. Some view her as a symbol of a resistance, a woman who said no and paid dearly for it, only to emerge stronger. Others read her as an archetype of rebirth, a metaphor for enduring trauma and reclaiming self. In modern birth centers, her name still appears, carved into amulets, sewn into baby blankets, or etched in cursive on painted tiles above doorways. She may not be in the liturgical calendar, but she's never been absent, because the dragon is still with us. Not the beast with wings and smoke, but the unseeable fears that live inside our lives. And sometimes, woman who bursts out of that fear, cross in hand, eyes forward. Breathing deeply is exactly what the world needs to remember. But this leaves us with one final question. If saints are removed from calendars, but not from memory, who decides their legacy? Is it the Vatican with its documents and councils? Or the people who, in quiet bedrooms and candlelit chapels, still whisper their names, their names? The image is simple. A young woman, arms bound, eyes cast toward the heavens, a cross clenched in one hand. A dragon, scales blackened like ash, coils beside Hert's mouth agape, fangs bared not in motion, but in anticipation. This is how Saint Margaret of Antioch was painted for centuries, especially in the margins of English psalters and French missals. The artwork was rarely dramatic. There were no flames or violence. Instead, the saint stood serene, her gaze often turned upward, ignoring the beast beside her. It was never about the dragon's power, it was about hers. And perhaps that is why her story lasted so long after her name was removed. You see, when the Vatican revised its calendar in 1969, it wasn't simply trimming excess. It was trying to create a version of sanctity that was clear, rational, and historically secure. But saints like Margaret never existed in that kind of clarity. They survived in paradox. Margaret was a contradiction. She had no known grave. Story bore no historical anchor. The details were tangled in symbolism and piety, not records. And yet, she was everywhere, chid into the corners of forgotten chapels, code in childbirth charms, echoed in folk poems, passed through centuries of women's voices. That's what makes her erasure so fascinating. Not because it succeeded, but because it didn't. Let's trace the quiet survival in the dusty archives of French convents. Scholars have found hundreds of birth girdles, long ribbons, or strips of cloth, often embroidered with prayers and names. St. Margaret's was one of the most common. Midwives in the 14th and 15th centuries would bind these around a woman's waist during labor, believing that her safe passage from the dragon's belly would guide the baby's safe passage into the world. These weren't official liturgical tools. They were everyday objects, folded, reused, passed down like family heirlooms. In one account from 15th century York, a woman swore under oath that she had been given a Margaret girdle by her mother, and that every woman in her family had used it. The cloth was stained, the threads worn, but the script still legible. Saint Margaret, guide this child as you were guided from darkness. No papal decree could erase that, and beyond physical relics, her story entered language. In some English dialects, the phrase, Margaret's moment, became slang for a difficult labor, even centuries after the saint fell out of favor in Rome in the 18th century. Protestant writers who mocked Catholic excess still seemed fascinated by Margaret. One Anglican bishop described her tale as charming nonsense, but included a lengthy summary of her legend in his collected works. He called her a fictional saint of admirable symbolism. It's almost a backhanded compliment, but even skeptics couldn't ignore the grip her story held in the Enlightenment, when rationalism challenged the mythic elements of religious life. Margaret's dragon became a target for ridicule. She was lumped with St. Christopher, who was said to have a dog's head, and St. Denis, who, legend claimed, walked several miles carrying his decapitated head. Saints like these were called fabulae, fables with little grounding in fact. Still, rural churches kept their Margaret altars. Why? 'Cause her story did something doctrine couldn't. It made suffering meaningful. It transformed chaos into narrative. The dragon was pain. The belly was confinement. The escape was survival. You didn't need to believe in literal monsters to understand what it meant. Even in the 20th century, Carte returned in unexpected places. During World War II, British nurses stationed in field hospitals across Europe painted her image on the walls of maternity wards, sometimes in secret. One 1944 letter from an army nurse in Italy describes a small mural of Margaret she helped a local nun paint near the hospital latrine. Her dragon is almost sweet-looking, the nurse writes, but it reminds us to keep fighting, even when all seems swallowed up. That's the thing about saints who become symbols. They don't stay in the stories. They leak into the world. When Vatican II revised the liturgical calendar, the changes weren't random. A commission reviewed the lives of every saint celebrated in the Universal Church. Their goal was noble clarity, consistency, historicity. But the process also revealed something else: how little we actually know about most early saints. Of the 90-plus saints removed, many had no biographies that could be traced to their lifetimes. Others were duplications, likely inspired by the same story told in different languages. Some, like Margaret, were built on layered metaphors that blurred history with hope. In her case, the committee stated that nothing reliable is known of her life, and so she was removed from the calendar. But they didn't forbid her veneration. Local churches were free to celebrate her feast if she held significance in their region, and so the dragon lived on. Even today, in towns like Montefiascone in Italy or Vovchansk in Ukraine, processions are held in Margaret's name. She is carried through the streets in painted icons, content accompanied by a wooden or cloth dragon, a small beast on wheels, pulled by children who laugh as it rattles down cobblestone alleys. In Scotland, Connie, one Highland parish, places her image in the maternity wing of its regional hospital. And in parts of Ethiopia, where she is known as Saint Marina, her story forms part of the religious calendar. with no sign of her being forgotten. More interesting still is how she has been reinterpreted in modern spirituality. In feminist theology, Margaret has been reclaimed as a symbol of resistance against patriarchal control, against silencing, against the historical minimization of women's voices. The dragon is reimagined, not just as pain, but as oppression. Her victory is not survival alone, but testimony and art therapy. Her story has been used to help trauma survivors visualize healing, moving from darkness into light, from captivity into autonomy. In these reimaginings, the details vary, but the structure endures, because every culture has a dragon, and every person has moments when the only way out is through. This leads us to the quiet question at the center of it all. What does it mean when a church removes a name from the calendar, but the people don't forget? Does sainthood come from councils and commissions, from candles lit in private, whispered names carried across centuries? The truth is, the church has never entirely controlled its saints. It has organized them, certainly declared, beatified, canonized, but saints grow from soil far older and deeper than papal authority. They grow from pain and memory, from stories that people refuse to let go of. Margaret's dragon was never meant to be literal. It was an imagia, way to make sense of the ways life swallows us whole. And that image, once seen, is hard to erase. In the end, her removal from the calendar didn't mark an end. It simply marked a return to the chapels tucked into hillsides, to the homes where mothers still sing ancient rhymes, to the pages of old books whose margins bloom with quiet sketches of a woman holding a cross beside a beast she refuses to fear. Saint Margaret may not be found in the Vatican's current liturgical guide, but she is found in birthrooms and poetry, in folklore and forgotten hymnals. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the saints we remember best aren't the ones preserved in stone and glass. They're the ones who stay with us softly, persistently, like breath long after we've stopped looking.